There is a story whispered in the corridors of the mind, a story that begins not with failure, but with victory. Picture, if you will, a climber who has reached the summit. The air is thin, crystalline, sharp against the lungs. Below stretches a landscape of clouds and conquered peaks. The sun blazes overhead, illuminating everything. This should be the moment of transcendence. The photographs will be glorious. The recognition will come. Yet standing there, alone in that rarefied air, the climber feels something unexpected, something that has no name in the language of success. It is not joy. It is not satisfaction. It is a hollowness so vast, so consuming, that the entire mountain seems to crumble beneath it. This is not metaphor. This is the lived experience of millions who have reached their summits, only to discover that the peak was never the destination. The achievement was never the answer. The success was never the cure for the wound they carried inside. Tonight, we descend into one of the most dangerous territories of the human psyche, the shadow of achievement. We explore a paradox so fundamental to modern existence that it shapes destinies, destroys lives, and yet remains invisible to those caught within its grip. We will trace the origins of this peculiar form of suffering, this emptiness born not from lack, but from having. We will walk through the psychological mechanisms that transform victory into void, accomplishment into anguish, recognition into a prison of the self. Consider this. You have spent years, perhaps decades, constructing an identity around achievement. You have climbed the ladder society presented to you. You have checked the boxes, earned the degrees, secured the positions, accumulated the symbols of success. Your resume is impressive. Your income is substantial. Your social media presence radiates accomplishment. People look at you with envy, with admiration, with that particular species of respect reserved for those who have made it. And yet, in the quiet hours, those moments between the performance of success and sleep, you feel it. A whisper at first, then a scream. The question that should never exist for someone who has everything: is this all there is? This question is more than doubt. It is the sound of the soul recognizing that it has been traded for something glittering and worthless. It is the moment when the ego, that magnificent architect of achievement, begins to crack, revealing the abyss it was constructed to conceal. The ancient Greeks had a word for this, kenosis, the emptying out. But they understood it as a sacred process, a necessary void that precedes transformation. Modern achievement culture has inverted this wisdom. It promises fullness through accumulation, completion through conquest, meaning through metrics. And so we pour ourselves into achievements, believing that the next milestone will fill the void, the next promotion, the next recognition, the next project, the next validation from the world's watching eyes. But here is what the philosophers and psychologists discovered, what the mystics knew all along. The void is not emptied by filling it. The shadow is not illuminated by accumulating light from external sources. The emptiness that follows achievement is not a problem to be solved, but a message to be understood, a signal from the deeper self that something essential has been sacrificed in the pursuit of something ultimately hollow. Carl Jung wrote extensively about the shadow, that repository of everything we deny, suppress, or fail to integrate about ourselves. But there is a particular shadow that forms around achievement, a darkness that feeds on success itself. This shadow grows stronger with every accolade, denser with every milestone reached. It is built from the parts of ourselves we abandoned to become achievers, the creativity sacrificed for credentials, the relationships postponed for career advancement, the spontaneity disciplined into productivity, the authentic self masked by the performing self. And here is the terrible irony. The more successful you become, the heavier the shadow grows. The higher you climb, the deeper the fall into emptiness. Because achievement, in its modern form, is not self-expansion, but self-contraction. It is not the expression of who you are, but the construction of who you think you should be. It is not liberation, but a golden cage, and the bars are made from your own accomplishments. Tonight's journey will be uncomfortable. We will examine the mechanisms by which success becomes suffering, the ways in which the ego co-opts our deepest longings and transforms them into endless hunger. We will explore the neuroscience of achievement addiction, the philosophy of existential emptiness, the psychology of false identities built on external validation. We will look at the architecture of modern life that trains us from childhood to seek worth in accomplishment rather than being. But we will also discover something profound, something that transforms the entire narrative. This emptiness is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of awakening. The void that appears at the summit is not darkness, but an opening, a doorway to a more authentic existence, a more integrated self, a more conscious way of being human. The ancient alchemists spoke of nigredo, the blackening, the descent into darkness that precedes transformation. They understood that gold is not created by accumulating more lead, but by transforming the essential nature of the substance itself. Your achievements are the lead. The emptiness you feel is the nigredo. And what lies beyond this darkness is not more achievement, but a fundamentally different relationship to life, to self, to meaning. So we begin in that space of victory that feels like loss, in that moment of success that tastes like ash, in that pinnacle of achievement where you discover you have climbed the wrong mountain entirely. We begin with the most dangerous question a successful person can ask. If I have everything I thought I wanted, why do I feel so empty? This is not a speech about failure. This is far more dangerous than that. This is about the failure that lives inside success, the emptiness that feeds on achievement, the way we lose ourselves in the very act of becoming what the world calls successful. This is about the sleep of the mind that occurs not in darkness, but in the glittering light of accomplishment. This is about waking up from the dream of success to discover it was a carefully constructed nightmare all along. Welcome to the shadow of achievement. Welcome to the exploration of the most sophisticated trap ever devised by the human psyche, the trap where the walls are made of gold and the prisoner is the one who holds the key. Let us descend together. The architecture of emptiness. To understand how success feeds emptiness, we must travel back to the origins, not just of achievement culture, but of the human psyche itself. We must examine the architecture of consciousness that makes this peculiar form of suffering possible. For the shadow of achievement is not a modern invention. It is an ancient pattern, woven into the fabric of human nature, that modernity has amplified into an existential crisis. The story begins in childhood, as most psychological stories do, but not in the way you might expect. Imagine a child of 3 or 4 years old, engaged in the pure act of creation. Perhaps they are drawing, not to produce anything recognizable, but simply to experience the movement of crayon against paper, the emergence of color, the joy of making marks in the world. There is no goal here, no audience to please, no standard to meet. There is only the act itself, complete and sufficient. This is what psychologists call intrinsic motivation, action driven by the inherent satisfaction of the activity itself. The child is not drawing to become an artist or to receive praise. They are drawing because the act of drawing is its own reward. In this moment, the child exists in what Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi would later call flow, a state of complete absorption where the self dissolves into the activity, where time becomes irrelevant, where there is no separation between doer and deed. But watch what happens next. An adult enters the room. "What a beautiful picture," they exclaim. "You're such a talented artist. Let's put this on the refrigerator so everyone can see how good you are." And in that moment, something fundamental shifts. The child's attention moves from the intrinsic pleasure of creation to the external reward of approval. The act of drawing, previously complete in itself, becomes a means to an end, the end being validation, recognition, love. This is the moment when achievement begins to separate from authenticity, when doing becomes divorced from being, when the external world's evaluation begins to matter more than internal experience. This is the birth of what psychologist Alfred Adler called the fictitious final goal, the belief that happiness, worth, and fulfillment lie not in the present moment, but in some future achievement that will finally prove our value. The child begins to draw not for the joy of drawing, but for the praise it generates, and gradually, imperceptibly, the source of satisfaction migrates from inside to outside. The internal compass is replaced by an external measurement system. Intrinsic motivation is colonized by extrinsic validation. Developmental psychologists have documented this shift with disturbing precision. In a famous series of studies by Edward Deci and Richard Ryan, children who loved drawing were divided into two groups. One group was rewarded for their drawings with gold stars and praise. The other was allowed to draw without any external reinforcement. Weeks later, when both groups were given the opportunity to draw freely, something remarkable happened. The children who had been rewarded showed significantly less interest in drawing. The external rewards had poisoned the intrinsic motivation. What was once done for love was now done for recognition, and without recognition, the activity lost its appeal. This is the foundational mechanism of the shadow of achievement, the replacement of intrinsic value with extrinsic validation. And once this replacement occurs, a terrible hunger is born, a hunger that can never be satisfied because it is looking for fulfillment in the wrong place entirely. But the architecture goes deeper still. We must examine the neuroscience of reward, for our brains are designed in ways that make achievement addiction almost inevitable in modern contexts. Deep within the brain lies a structure called the ventral tegmental area, part of what neuroscientists call the reward circuit. When we anticipate or achieve something our brain interprets as valuable, this region releases dopamine, a neurotransmitter associated with pleasure, motivation, and learning. This is an ancient system, evolved over millions of years to help our ancestors survive. The dopamine hit you get from finding food, avoiding danger, or achieving social status was adaptive in the ancestral environment. But here's what makes this system dangerous in the modern world. Dopamine is released more strongly in anticipation of reward than in the experience of reward itself. Your brain gives you a bigger hit when you're pursuing the goal than when you achieve it. This is why the journey often feels more alive than the destination, why the hunt is more thrilling than the capture, why ambition feels more energizing than accomplishment. Neuroscientist Robert Sapolsky has demonstrated that our brains are essentially anticipation machines. We're wired to be more motivated by the pursuit than the possession, more excited by the climb than the summit. This made perfect sense in an environment of scarcity where you needed to keep hunting for the next meal, the next shelter, the next opportunity to reproduce. But in an achievement-driven culture, this neurological quirk becomes a trap. You experience a surge of motivation and energy while pursuing the promotion, the degree, the recognition. Your brain floods with dopamine during the chase. But when you finally achieve it, when you reach the summit, the dopamine drops. The neurological reward for arrival is significantly less than the reward for pursuit, and so you experience not joy but letdown, not fulfillment but emptiness, not satisfaction but the immediate hunger for the next goal, the next dopamine surge, the next pursuit. This is achievement addiction at the neurological level, a hamster wheel built into the very architecture of the brain, now hijacked by a culture that endlessly generates new summits to chase, new validations to pursue, new achievements to hunger for. Psychologists call this the hedonic treadmill, the tendency to return to a baseline level of happiness despite positive changes in circumstances. You get the promotion, and for a brief moment there's elation. Then, remarkably quickly, you adapt. The new position becomes normal, the elevated status becomes your baseline, and the hunger returns, demanding the next level, the next achievement, the next hit of dopamine-fueled pursuit. But there's something even more insidious occurring beneath this neurological pattern. The philosopher Søren Kierkegaard identified it in the 19th century, calling it the despair of necessity, the state of being so constrained by external demands and social roles that you lose contact with your own possibility, your own authentic potential. Achievement culture creates a particular form of this despair. You become so identified with achieving, with meeting standards, with climbing ladders, that you forget to ask whether these are ladders you actually want to climb, whether these summits matter to your soul. The existential psychologist Viktor Frankl, who survived Auschwitz and devoted his life to understanding meaning, distinguished between achievement and meaning in profound ways. He observed that meaning comes not from accumulating accomplishments, but from self-transcendence, from connecting to something beyond the ego, from serving values larger than personal success. But achievement culture inverts this wisdom. It teaches us that meaning is found through personal accumulation, that self-transcendence means transcending others by outperforming them, that value comes from being superior rather than from being connected. And so we construct identities around achievement. We become our resumes, our titles, our metrics of success. The ego, that structure Jung described as the conscious personality, builds itself entirely around external validation. I am a successful entrepreneur. I am a respected academic. I am a high-performing executive. The I am gets fused with the achievement, and the achievement becomes the entirety of identity. This is what Jung called the persona, the mask we wear for the world, the social role we perform. But when the persona becomes confused with the self, when the mask becomes the face, a dangerous fragmentation occurs. Everything that doesn't fit the achievement narrative gets relegated to the shadow, the rejected, suppressed, unacknowledged aspects of the psyche. Your need for rest becomes laziness to be conquered. Your desire for connection becomes distraction from productivity. Your uncertainty becomes weakness to be hidden. Your creativity becomes something to be monetized rather than experienced. Your vulnerability becomes a liability in the competitive landscape. Your authentic self, with all its contradictions, longings, and non-productive qualities, becomes the enemy of your achieving self. The architecture of emptiness is now complete. You have been trained from childhood to seek validation externally. Your brain is wired to crave the pursuit more than the arrival. Your culture has taught you to equate worth with achievement, meaning with success, identity with accomplishment. And your psyche has split into fragments, the persona that achieves and the shadow that contains everything the achiever had to abandon. This is the setup for the central paradox. The more you achieve, the more you construct an identity around achievement, the more you reinforce the very patterns that guarantee emptiness upon arrival. Because the emptiness is not a failure of achievement, it is the inevitable result of the achievement orientation itself. You are not empty because you haven't achieved enough. You are empty because achievement cannot fill the void it creates. The ancient Buddhist texts speak of tanha, the thirst, the craving, the endless hunger that arises from seeking permanent satisfaction in impermanent things. Achievement is the perfect embodiment of tanha. Every accomplishment is impermanent. Every summit is temporary. Every validation fades, requiring renewal. And so the thirst continues, unquenchable, because you are drinking from the wrong well entirely. Yet this diagnosis is incomplete without understanding the historical and cultural forces that have amplified this ancient pattern into a modern epidemic. We must examine how achievement culture evolved, how it became the dominant religion of the modern world, how success became the primary metric by which we measure the worth of a human life. The roots reach back to the Protestant work ethic, to the Industrial Revolution's transformation of human labor into mechanized productivity, to the rise of capitalism's endless growth imperative. Max Weber documented how religious salvation became secularized into economic success, how proving your worth to God became proving your worth through work, how spiritual transcendence became material accumulation. But the true explosion of achievement culture occurred in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, with the rise of what sociologist Zygmunt Bauman called liquid modernity, a world where all solid structures dissolve, where tradition offers no guidance, where identity must be constantly constructed and reconstructed through performance and achievement. In this liquid world, you are what you accomplish. There is no inherent worth, no given identity, no stable foundation. Everything must be earned, performed, demonstrated, validated. Your social media profile becomes a curated highlight reel of achievement. Your LinkedIn page becomes a database of accomplishments. Your entire existence becomes a resume submitted for the world's evaluation. And the evaluation never ends. The goalposts constantly move. What was impressive yesterday is ordinary today. What secured status in one era becomes inadequate in the next. The philosopher Byung-Chul Han calls this the achievement society, a world where we are all simultaneously entrepreneur and employee of the self, constantly optimizing, improving, achieving, never arriving because there is nowhere to arrive to. This is the historical culmination of the architecture we've explored, a culture that has weaponized the human hunger for meaning, that has hijacked our neurological reward systems, that has fractured our psyches into achieving personas and rejected shadows, all in service of an economic system that requires endless productivity, endless consumption, endless growth. And at the personal level, this manifests as the most sophisticated form of self-betrayal ever devised. You believe you are climbing toward freedom while constructing your own prison. You believe you are building an identity while abandoning your authentic self. You believe you are pursuing fulfillment while feeding the very emptiness you seek to escape. The origins are clear now. The architecture stands revealed. We see how personal psychology, neuroscience, cultural conditioning, and historical forces converge to create the perfect conditions for the shadow of achievement, that peculiar form of suffering where success itself becomes the source of emptiness, where victory tastes like defeat, where the summit reveals not transcendence, but the terrible realization that you have climbed the wrong mountain entirely. But understanding the origins is only the beginning. Now we must descend deeper still, into the lived experience of this shadow, into the actual mechanisms by which achievement feeds emptiness, into the crisis that occurs when the entire architecture of the achieving self begins to collapse. Now we must enter the darkness. Descent into the golden void. The descent begins not with dramatic collapse, but with a whisper, a tiny crack in the architecture of achievement that slowly, inexorably widens until the entire structure threatens to crumble. It often starts with a moment that should be triumph. You've landed the position you've been pursuing for years. You've published the book. You've received the award. You've reached the income level that once seemed impossible. The external world reflects success back to you. Your Instagram post about the achievement receives hundreds of likes. Your family expresses pride. Your colleagues offer congratulations. By every objective measure, you have succeeded. And yet, driving home that evening, or lying in bed that night, or sitting alone in your impressive office the next morning, you feel it. A flatness, a distance, a peculiar absence where joy should be. The achievement that was supposed to change everything has changed nothing fundamental. The person you are the day after the success is essentially the same person you were the day before. The wound you thought achievement would heal remains open. The emptiness you hoped success would fill remains vast. This is the first stage of the descent, the recognition that achievement does not deliver what it promised, not because you achieved the wrong thing, but because achievement itself cannot fulfill the function you assigned to it. The ladder was real, the climb was real, but the ladder was leaning against the wrong wall entirely. Psychologists have a term for this, arrival fallacy. It's the false belief that reaching a goal will create lasting happiness. But the research is devastating in its clarity. Major positive life events, promotions, awards, milestones, produce happiness spikes that typically last between 3 days and 3 months before you return to your baseline emotional state. The hedonic treadmill recalibrates. The new normal becomes normal. and you're left with the disconcerting realization that the summit offers no permanent transformation. But here's where the shadow deepens. You cannot simply accept this and move on. Because if achievement doesn't provide meaning, worth, and fulfillment, then what does? You have organized your entire life around the pursuit. You have sacrificed relationships, health, creativity, presence, spontaneity, all on the altar of achievement. If achievement is revealed as hollow, what does that make the sacrifice? What does that make you? The ego cannot tolerate this question. It has too much invested in the achievement narrative, and so begins a psychological doubling down that Jung called inflation, the ego's attempt to maintain its structure by pursuing ever greater achievements, more impressive accomplishments, higher summits. You tell yourself the problem was that this particular achievement wasn't big enough. The next one will be different. The next promotion, the next project, the next level of recognition, that will be the one that finally delivers the fulfillment you seek. And so you accelerate, you work harder, you sacrifice more, you optimize, improve, achieve at increasingly impressive levels. But something insidious is happening beneath this intensification. You are running from the emptiness rather than examining it. You are using achievement as a drug to numb the existential pain of recognizing that achievement is the problem, not the solution. You have become an achievement addict, and like all addictions, it requires increasing doses to achieve the same effect. The neuroscience here is brutally clear. Repeated exposure to reward circuits causes desensitization. The dopamine receptors literally downregulate. What once produced a significant response now produces a muted one. You need bigger achievements, more impressive successes, higher stakes to get the same neurological hit. This is tolerance, the same mechanism that drives drug addiction, now playing out in the realm of accomplishment. And as with any addiction, there are withdrawal symptoms when the achievements slow or stop. Anxiety, restlessness, a sense of worthlessness, panic at the thought of not achieving, not producing, not climbing. Your identity has become so fused with achievement that any pause in the achieving feels like ego death. You literally don't know who you are when you're not accomplishing something impressive. This is what psychologists call contingent self-esteem, self-worth that depends entirely on external validation and achievement. Your value as a human being has become conditional on performance. When you achieve, you feel worthy. When you don't, you feel worthless. There is no stable ground of being, no inherent sense of value independent of accomplishment. You have outsourced your entire sense of self to the external world's evaluation. But the descent deepens still, because the shadow of achievement doesn't only create emptiness, it also generates a more sinister phenomenon, the fragmentation of the self. Remember, everything that doesn't serve the achieving persona gets relegated to the shadow. But these rejected aspects don't disappear. They accumulate in the unconscious, growing more powerful, more demanding, more distorted by their exclusion from conscious awareness. Your need for rest becomes a shameful weakness that must be hidden. You develop elaborate rituals to conceal any sign of tiredness, any admission that you're human and finite. You drink excessive caffeine, you work through exhaustion, you wear your sleep deprivation as a badge of honor. The natural need for restoration becomes the enemy. Your desire for connection becomes something to be fit in around the edges of achievement. Relationships become transactional. Networking opportunities, strategic alliances, sources of validation. The spontaneous joy of human connection, the purposeless pleasure of friendship, the vulnerable intimacy of love, these become luxuries you'll attend to later after you've achieved enough to deserve them. Your creativity, that wild, uncontrollable force that doesn't serve predetermined goals, becomes problematic. It must be channeled into monetizable products, productivity hacks, personal brand building. The purposeless play, the generative uncertainty, the joy of creation without outcome, these get suppressed because they don't contribute to measurable achievement. Your body becomes an instrument of performance rather than a source of wisdom. You override its signals of fatigue, hunger, stress, pain. You optimize its output through biohacking, supplements, efficiency protocols. You treat it like a machine to be tuned rather than a living system to be honored. And the body's rebellion, through illness, injury, burnout, gets interpreted as weakness to be conquered rather than wisdom to be heard. Your authentic feelings, especially the negative ones like sadness, fear, uncertainty, loneliness, become liabilities in the achievement game. You develop sophisticated mechanisms of suppression, distraction, and denial. You stay perpetually busy to avoid feeling. You consume content, pursue goals, stay in motion, anything to avoid the stillness where suppressed emotion might surface, and perhaps most devastatingly, your authentic self, the you beneath all the roles and performances and achievements, becomes a stranger. You've been performing for so long, wearing the mask of the achiever so continuously, that you've lost contact with who you actually are beneath the persona. Your preferences, values, desires, longings, these have all been curated to serve the achievement narrative. What do you actually want, independent of what will impress others? What brings you joy, separate from what generates external validation? Who are you when no one is watching and nothing is being measured? These questions become terrifying because the honest answer is, you don't know. The achieving self has colonized consciousness so completely that the authentic self has been exiled to the shadow, becoming a ghost that haunts the edges of awareness, occasionally breaking through in dreams, in moments of crisis, in the persistent whisper of emptiness that no achievement can silence. Jung warned about this precise danger. He wrote that the persona, the ideal picture of a man as he should be, is inwardly compensated by feminine weakness, and as the individual outwardly plays the strong man, so he becomes inwardly a woman, meaning that the one-sided development of any psychological function creates an equal and opposite imbalance in the unconscious. The more rigidly you maintain the achieving persona, the more powerful and dangerous the shadow becomes. And the shadow doesn't remain passive. It begins to rebel, to sabotage, to force recognition through symptoms. This is when the descent enters its most dangerous phase, the emergence of what psychologists call shadow projection, and what I call the dark mirror of achievement. You begin to see your own rejected qualities in others, and you react with disproportionate emotion. The colleague who takes vacations becomes lazy and uncommitted because you've exiled your own need for rest. The friend who pursues creative projects without commercial viability becomes foolish and impractical because you've suppressed your own artistic longings. The person who admits vulnerability becomes weak and pathetic because you've denied your own humanity. But the projection goes deeper still. You become hyper-aware of others' achievements, constantly comparing, constantly measuring, constantly feeling either superior or inferior based on relative accomplishment. Social media becomes a torture device, each scrolling session a reminder of what you haven't achieved, what others have accomplished, where you rank in the invisible hierarchy of success. Your relationships become contaminated by competition. Your joy becomes contaminated by envy. Your own achievements become contaminated by their insufficiency relative to others. This is the nightmare of the achievement society. You are perpetually inadequate because there is always someone who has achieved more, always another level to reach, always a way in which you fall short. And because your self-worth is contingent on achievement, every comparison becomes an existential threat. You are not just competing for resources or status, you are competing for the right to feel valuable as a human being. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche diagnosed this condition brilliantly in his concept of ressentiment, a deep psychological state of suppressed envy and hostility that arises when you measure yourself against others and find yourself wanting. But achievement culture universalizes resentment. It creates a social system where everyone is simultaneously superior and inferior, where comparison is constant, where your worth is always provisional, always dependent on maintaining or improving your position in the hierarchy. And this creates a peculiar psychological hell. You cannot enjoy your achievements because you're hyper-aware of what you haven't achieved. You cannot rest in your accomplishments because someone else has accomplished more. You cannot feel satisfied with your position because there are higher positions. The summit is never the summit. It's always just a base camp for the next, higher peak. Meanwhile, the existential questions you've been avoiding through achievement begin to surface with increasing urgency. Questions that achievement was supposed to answer, but never could. Who am I when I'm not achieving? What is the purpose of my life beyond accumulating accomplishments? Have I been living my life or performing someone else's script? What have I sacrificed in the pursuit of success, and can it be recovered? Is there any stable ground of being beneath the endless achieving? These questions are dangerous because they threaten the entire architecture of the achieving self. They suggest that you might have been climbing the wrong mountain, that the sacrifices might have been unnecessary, that the persona you've constructed might be a prison rather than a palace. And this is when the real crisis begins, what Jung called enantiodromia, the moment when a psychological function that has been carried to its extreme flips into its opposite. The achiever becomes the empty one. The successful person becomes the despairing one. The ladder becomes the abyss. Achievement itself becomes the source of the deepest suffering. This is the nadir of the descent. The recognition that you have been betraying yourself in the name of becoming yourself, that you have been abandoning your authenticity in pursuit of identity, that you have been feeding your emptiness with the very thing, achievement, that creates the emptiness in the first place. Some people reach this point through burnout, the complete physical and emotional exhaustion that forces a reckoning. The body and psyche simply refuse to continue the charade. Every attempt to achieve feels like pushing through concrete. The motivation disappears. The dopamine system crashes. The whole neurological and psychological machinery of achievement simply stops functioning. Others reach it through what Kierkegaard called the sickness unto death, a despair so profound that it reveals the emptiness of all worldly pursuits, including achievement. This is not depression in the clinical sense, though it may manifest with depressive symptoms. It's an existential recognition that the way you've been living is fundamentally misaligned with your deepest nature, that no amount of external success can compensate for the internal betrayal. Still others arrive through what Jung called the confrontation with the shadow, a moment when all the rejected, suppressed, exiled aspects of the self erupt into consciousness, demanding recognition. This can come through crisis, illness, loss, or simply the accumulation of years of suppression reaching a breaking point. The achieving persona cracks, and through the cracks, the shadow emerges, bringing with it all the pain, longing, creativity, vulnerability, and authenticity that had been exiled. And in this moment, you face a choice that will determine the rest of your life. You can attempt to repair the persona, to redouble your commitment to achievement, to suppress the shadow back into unconsciousness and continue the climb. Or you can surrender to the descent, allow the achieving self to die, and discover what lies beyond the architecture of achievement. This choice is terrifying because the achieving self is all you've known. It's your identity, your source of worth, your map of meaning. To let it die feels like ego death, and in a sense it is. But here's what the mystics, the psychologists, and the wisdom traditions all understood. Ego death is not the same as annihilation. It is transformation. It is the death of the false self that allows the birth of the authentic self. It is the dissolution of the persona that allows integration with the shadow. This is the threshold of Act 3, the moment when descent becomes transformation, when crisis becomes awakening, when the void at the heart of achievement reveals itself not as emptiness to be feared, but as openness to be embraced. But to cross this threshold requires courage of a kind that achievement never taught you. It requires facing the shadow, integrating the rejected aspects of self, questioning the entire architecture of meaning you've constructed, and discovering a fundamentally different relationship to life, to worth, to identity. It requires, in short, waking up from the dream of achievement into something more real, more alive, more authentic, even if that reality is more uncertain, more vulnerable, more difficult to measure than any achievement could ever be. The golden void awaits. The shadow has revealed its face. The architecture of the achieving self is crumbling, and in the rubble, something new wants to be born. Now we ascend. Integration and the authentic life. The journey upward begins in the strangest place, by going deeper into the void rather than trying to escape it. This is the paradox at the heart of psychological transformation. The wound must be entered before it can heal. The shadow must be faced before it can integrate. The emptiness must be fully experienced before it reveals what it actually is. Let us be clear. This is not the kind of teaching that achievement culture wants you to hear. There is no 5-step program here, no optimization protocol, no hack to bypass the difficult work of psychological integration. The awakening from the shadow of achievement is not another achievement. It is the dissolution of the achieving orientation itself. But dissolution is not destruction, it is transformation. And the first step in this transformation is the most counterintuitive. You must stop trying to fix the emptiness you feel at the summit, that void that appears when achievement fails to deliver fulfillment. This is not a problem to be solved. It is a message to be understood. It is the psyche's wisdom, breaking through the noise of achievement culture to tell you something essential. You have been looking for yourself in the wrong place. Jung called this process individuation, the lifelong journey of becoming who you actually are rather than who you think you should be. And individuation always begins with the recognition that the persona, no matter how successful, is not the self. The mask is not the face. The role is not the essence. When you stop trying to fill the void with more achievement and instead turn to face it directly, something remarkable occurs. The void begins to speak. It reveals itself not as emptiness, but as an opening, a space where the authentic self, long suppressed by the demands of the achieving persona, can finally emerge. This emergence doesn't happen all at once. It's a gradual awakening, often beginning with small recognitions. You notice a moment of genuine joy that has nothing to do with achievement, the taste of coffee in the morning, the quality of light at sunset, the sound of rain, the warmth of genuine connection with another human. These moments have always been available, but you were too focused on the next summit to notice them. Now, in the space created by the void, they become luminous. You begin to distinguish between extrinsic motivation, doing things for external reward, and intrinsic motivation, doing things because they are inherently meaningful or joyful, and you start to notice how much of your life has been driven by the former, how few activities you engage in purely for their own sake. This is where the reclamation begins. You start to experiment with action without achievement orientation. You create something with no intention to share it or monetize it. You play without keeping score. You read for pleasure rather than self-improvement. You engage in conversation without networking intent. You allow yourself to be bad at something new, to fumble and fail, without it threatening your identity. These small acts are revolutionary because they begin to loosen the grip of the achieving self. They demonstrate that worth and meaning can exist independent of external validation. They remind you that there is a dimension of existence that cannot be measured, optimized, or ranked, and that this dimension might be more essential than all your achievements combined. But true integration requires going further still. It requires what Jung called shadow work, the conscious examination and incorporation of everything you rejected to become an achiever. This is uncomfortable work. It means acknowledging the parts of yourself you've been ashamed of, the laziness, the vulnerability, the uncertainty, the need for connection, the wild creativity that doesn't serve productivity. It means recognizing that these aren't weaknesses to be overcome, but essential aspects of wholeness that have been exiled. The shadow, Jung discovered, contains not only the rejected negativity, but also the rejected gold, the talents, potentials, and qualities you suppressed because they didn't fit the achievement narrative. The person who became a lawyer to please their parents might discover a shadow artist. The executive who optimized away spontaneity might find a shadow playfulness. The academic who intellectualized emotion might encounter a shadow emotionality. Integration means bringing these aspects back into consciousness, not to act them out unconsciously, but to include them in a more complete self-understanding. It means developing what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold opposites in creative tension rather than splitting into either-or thinking. You can be both ambitious and at peace, both productive and restful, both achieving and accepting, both striving and surrendering. The either-or logic of the achieving mind gives way to the both and wisdom of the integrated psyche. This integration is not comfortable. It requires admitting that you've been one-sided, that the persona you've carefully constructed is incomplete, that some of your sacrifices were unnecessary and some of your achievements were compensations for inner wounds rather than expressions of authentic desire. But as this integration deepens, something profound shifts. The center of your identity begins to move from the persona to something deeper, what Jung called the self with a capital S, the totality of the psyche beyond ego consciousness. Your sense of who you are becomes less dependent on external roles and achievements and more rooted in a direct experience of being. This is where the concept of enoughness emerges, not as settling or giving up on growth, but as recognizing that your fundamental worth is not contingent on achievement. You are enough, not because you've achieved enough, but because enoughness is your essential nature. The wound that you've been trying to heal through achievement, the wound of felt inadequacy, begins to close not through accumulation but through recognition. It was always already healed. The inadequacy was the story, not the reality. But integration is only half the awakening. The other half involves discovering new sources of meaning beyond achievement, what Viktor Frankl called the will to meaning as opposed to the will to power. Frankl, who survived the death camps of the Holocaust, made a profound observation. Those who survived were not necessarily the strongest or most fortunate, but those who had a meaning to live for that transcended their circumstances. And this meaning, he discovered, never came from achievement or success. It came from three sources: creative work that expressed values, experiences of beauty or love, and the attitude taken toward unavoidable suffering. Notice, none of these sources of meaning are contingent on external validation. Creative work is meaningful because it expresses something authentic, not because it's recognized. Love is meaningful because of the quality of connection, not because of what it achieves. And the attitude towards suffering is entirely internal. It's about who you choose to be in the face of difficulty, not about avoiding or conquering the difficulty. This reorientation from achievement to meaning is the essence of the awakening. You begin to ask different questions, not how can I achieve more, but what is trying to come through me, not how do I become successful, but how do I become more fully myself, not what will impress others, but what serves life. These questions lead to a fundamentally different way of engaging with the world. The philosopher Martin Heidegger distinguished between what he called ready to hand and present at hand, between treating things, including ourselves, as tools for achieving goals and experiencing them in their intrinsic being. Achievement culture keeps us perpetually in ready-to-hand mode, where everything is instrumental, a means to an end. The awakening involves learning to dwell in present-at-hand experience, where things are appreciated for what they are, rather than what they can do for us. You begin to relate to your work differently. Instead of asking, "What will this achieve?" you ask, "Does this express something authentic? Does it serve something beyond my ego? Does it contribute to the world in a way that matters to me, independent of recognition?" You begin to relate to yourself differently. Instead of constant self-improvement, you practice self-acceptance. Instead of optimizing every moment, you allow spaciousness. Instead of treating your body as a performance machine, you honor it as a living, feeling, wise organism. You begin to relate to others differently. Instead of networking and instrumentalizing relationships, you practice genuine presence and connection. You allow yourself to be seen in your vulnerability, not just your strength. You offer your attention without agenda, your care without calculation. And gradually, something extraordinary occurs. Life becomes more vivid, more meaningful, more satisfying, not despite the reduction in achievement orientation, but because of it. You discover what the poet Rainer Maria Rilke meant when he wrote that the only journey is the one within. The external journey of achievement was always a displacement of the internal journey of becoming. But let's be precise about what this awakening is not, because there's a common misunderstanding that must be addressed. This is not about abandoning ambition or becoming passive. It's not about rejecting all achievement or pretending that external goals don't matter. It's not about spiritual bypassing, using psychological or spiritual concepts to avoid the practical realities of living in the world. Rather, it's about transforming your relationship to achievement. Ambition becomes healthy when it's rooted in authentic values rather than compensating for inadequacy. Goals become meaningful when they express who you are rather than prove who you should be. Achievement becomes appropriate when it's in service of something beyond the ego rather than feeding the ego's endless hunger. The philosopher Nietzsche, despite his complex relationship with ambition, understood this distinction. He wrote about the difference between the will to power, driven by resentment and inadequacy, a reactive striving against others, and the will to power as authentic self-overcoming, as becoming more fully what you essentially are. The latter is not about defeating others, but about expressing your unique potential. This reoriented ambition feels different. It's less frenetic, less driven by anxiety and comparison, less contaminated by the need for external validation. You can pursue challenging goals with intensity and commitment, but the goals arise from inner necessity rather than outer pressure. You work hard, but the work feels more like play, more like flow, more like expression, more like service. And crucially, your worth stops being contingent on the outcome. You can fail at a project without it meaning you're a failure as a person. You can succeed without it inflating your ego. You can be ambitious without being attached. This is what the Buddhist tradition calls right effort, exertion without craving, striving without clinging, doing without being consumed by doing. The paradox is that this psychological shift often leads to greater effectiveness, not less. When you're no longer achievement addicted, you make clearer decisions. When you're not constantly comparing yourself to others, you can focus on your actual work. When you're not driven by the fear of inadequacy, you take more intelligent risks. When you're not attached to outcomes, you can be more creative and adaptive. But even if this weren't true, even if integration led to less external achievement, it would still be worth pursuing. Because the question that has been haunting this entire journey finally gets answered. What is the point of achievement if the achiever is hollow? What is the value of climbing every mountain if you've lost your soul in the ascent? The awakening is the recovery of soul. It's the return to wholeness. It's the integration of persona and shadow, ego and self, achievement and being. It's the recognition that you are not your resume, not your accomplishments, not your status, not your performance. You are the mysterious, irreducible, invaluable consciousness that witnesses all of these without being reducible to any of them. This brings us to perhaps the most profound insight of the entire journey. The emptiness that appeared at the summit was never emptiness at all. It was fullness that you couldn't recognize because you were looking for the wrong thing. You were looking for ego satisfaction, and what appeared was being itself. You were looking for validation, and what appeared was presence. You were looking for worth, and what appeared was the recognition that worth is not something to be earned, but something to be realized. You are worthy by virtue of being, not by virtue of doing. The void at the heart of achievement is actually the groundless ground of existence, what the mystics call the source, what Buddhists call emptiness with a capital E, what depth psychologists call the self. It appears as emptiness only when viewed through the lens of achievement. When you shift the lens, when you stop trying to grasp and instead learn to rest, the emptiness reveals itself as infinite openness, the space where authentic life becomes possible. This is what the spiritual traditions have been pointing to all along. You already are what you've been trying to become through achievement. The adequacy you seek through accomplishment is your original nature. The worth you try to earn through performance is your birthright. The wholeness you pursue through accumulation is already complete. It's the pursuing itself that fragments it. Stop, rest, be. And in that stopping, that resting, that being, discover what was always already here, obscured only by the frenetic effort to get somewhere other than where you are. Living from integration. And so we return, but we do not return to where we began. We return transformed. The climber who reached the summit and discovered emptiness has descended into that emptiness and found it to be fullness. The achiever who built an identity on external validation has dissolved that identity and discovered something more essential beneath. The persona has integrated with the shadow. The wound has become wisdom. This is not a triumphant ending in the way achievement culture defines triumph. There is no final victory here, no ultimate summit reached, no complete and permanent transformation. The journey of becoming conscious, of living authentically, of integrating persona and shadow, this journey continues. It deepens, it evolves, but it is no longer driven by the desperate hunger of inadequacy. It is sustained by something quieter, more mysterious, more true, the simple desire to be fully alive, fully awake, fully human. What does life look like after this awakening? Not perfect. Integration doesn't eliminate challenge or difficulty, but fundamentally different in quality. You still set goals and pursue achievements, but they feel lighter, less compulsive, more playful. They arise from genuine interest rather than compulsive proving. You can work intensely without losing yourself in the work. You can fail without it shattering your sense of worth. You can succeed without it inflating your ego. You've developed what the Buddhists call equanimity, a balanced awareness that doesn't cling to pleasure or push away pain, that meets success and failure with the same fundamental groundedness. Not indifference, but a deeper engagement that isn't dependent on outcomes. Your relationships deepen because you're less defended, less performing, more available for genuine connection. The vulnerability you once saw as weakness becomes the very quality that allows intimacy. The uncertainty you tried to eliminate becomes the openness that allows discovery. Your creativity flourishes because it's no longer constrained by the need to be monetizable or impressive. You create because creation is your nature, not because creation will validate your worth. The purpose of art, you discover, is not to add to your achievements, but to express something inexpressible, to make visible what cannot be measured. You develop a different relationship with time, less future-oriented, less anxious about the next thing, more capable of being present. This moment, right now, with all its ordinary details, becomes sufficient. Not in a way that breeds complacency, but in a way that allows genuine appreciation for what is, even as you work toward what might be. The shadow of achievement, that emptiness born from success, was never your enemy. It was your teacher, your guide, your invitation to a deeper way of being. It appeared as suffering only because you resisted its message. When you finally listened, when you stopped trying to fill it and instead entered it, you discovered what every wisdom tradition has known. The wound is where the light enters. The crack in the persona is where the self emerges. The void at the summit is where the journey truly begins. This is the secret that achievement culture cannot tolerate. You are already whole. Your worth is not contingent. Your value is not earned. The adequacy you seek through endless accomplishment is your essential nature, obscured only by the seeking itself. But knowing this intellectually is not enough. It must be lived, practiced, embodied. Each day presents new opportunities to choose. Will you react from the achieving persona, or respond from the integrated self? Will you treat this moment as a means to a future end, or experience it as complete in itself? Will you measure your worth by external metrics, or rest in the inherent value of your being? These choices accumulate. They become a way of life. And gradually, almost imperceptibly, the golden cage of achievement transforms into something else. Not a prison, but a playground. Not a burden, but a creative possibility. Not a measure of worth, but an expression of aliveness. The ancient alchemists spoke of opus contra naturam, the great work that goes against nature. But there's another kind of opus, one that goes with nature. The work of becoming fully yourself, of integrating what has been split, of living from wholeness rather than performing from fracture. This is not achievement. This is something more subtle, more profound, more difficult, and more rewarding. This is the emergence of authentic being. This is consciousness awakening to itself. This is the evolution that occurs when you stop climbing toward an imagined future and start inhabiting the living present. Success, you finally understand, is not a destination to reach, but a quality of engagement. Not what you accomplish, but how fully you show up, how deeply you connect, how courageously you embody your authentic nature in each moment. And emptiness? Emptiness was never the problem. Emptiness was always the answer. Not as void, but as openness, not as lack, but as infinite possibility. Not as the end of achievement, but as the beginning of something that cannot be named, but only lived. The shadow of achievement has been illuminated. The sleep of the mind has been interrupted. The golden cage has been recognized as a cage. And now, standing in the ruins of the achieving self, something new wants to be born. Something that was always there, waiting beneath the noise of ambition, beyond the hunger for validation, deeper than the persona could ever reach. You. Not the you that achieves, but the you that is. Not the you that proves worth, but the you that is worth. Not the you that climbs toward completion, but the you that is already, always, mysteriously, miraculously complete. The journey continues. But you are no longer walking toward something. You are walking as something, as consciousness exploring itself, as authenticity expressing itself, as being celebrating its own existence. Welcome home. Welcome to the life that was always waiting beyond achievement. Welcome to yourself.